please. My son can't breathe. His lips are turning blue. You have to look at him right now. Please, hurry, please. I already called someone, sir. Please step back and take a seat. A doctor will see him as soon as one is free. The clock above the triage desk read 9:47 p.m., and it had not changed in what felt like an hour, though it had only been 4 minutes. Daniel Cole was on his knees on the linoleum of the Ashgrove Regional Medical Center emergency waiting room, a 6-year-old boy folded against his chest, and the boy's small hand was gripping the collar of his father's jacket the way a person grips a railing over open water. Milo's breath was coming in thin, whistling pulls, each one shorter than the last. His lips had gone the color of a bruise. Charge nurse Renata Voss did not look up from her clipboard a second time. She had already looked once. She had seen a man in a stained gray work jacket, sleeves rolled, boots scuffed pale at the toes, kneeling too close to her desk with a child who was, by her 14 years of triage experience, breathing. Labored, yes, frightening to a parent, yes, but breathing. She had 4 ambulances inbound. She had a gunshot wound in Bay 2 and a cardiac arrest that had just cleared the doors in Bay 4, its gurney still rocking on its wheels. She had 1 resident, Dr. Okafor, currently intubating a stroke patient, and a waiting room with 31 people in various stages of a Tuesday night gone wrong. She had made a call. In her mind, it was the correct one. I already called someone, sir, she said again. Not unkindly, but with the flat, professional patience of a woman who had said some version of this sentence 4,000 times and needed it to be enough. A doctor will see him as soon as one is free. What she did not know, what nobody in that waiting room knew, because Daniel Cole had never once, in the 8 months he had swept these same floors after midnight, told a single person, was that the man in the gray jacket had once been able to open an airway with a ballpoint pen and a steady hand, in the back of a Humvee doing 60 over broken road, with someone screaming in someone else's blood on his sleeves. He had not done anything like that in 6 years. He had promised himself, and a woman who was no longer alive to hold him to it, that he never would again. Milo made a sound that was not quite a word and not quite a cry, and Daniel felt every year of that promise come apart at once. Listen to me, Daniel said, and his voice had changed. Not louder, just different, flattened out into something with no room left for pleading in it. I need you to look at him, not later, now. His retractions are getting worse and his sats are dropping. I can see it in his color, and if you wait. For the cue, he is not going to be breathing by the time it's his turn. Renata's pen stopped. It was the word retractions that did it, though she would not admit that to herself for hours yet. Parents said, he's struggling, he's wheezing, something's wrong with his chest. They did not say retractions, the small, precise clinical word for the way skin pulls inward between the ribs when a body is fighting for air it cannot get. She filed the strangeness of it away in the part of her mind that had, over 14 years, learned to distrust anything that did not fit the shape of the form in front of her, and she looked back down at her clipboard. Because the form in front of her said male, 6 ears, resp distress, and there were 2 other children ahead of him on paper, even if not in front of her eyes. Sir, I understand you're frightened, she said, in the tone reserved for the frightened. But I have a system, and the system exists so that everyone gets seen. If I let every parent who says right now go ahead of the line, I don't have a line anymore. I have chaos. Daniel looked at her for 1 long second, and something passed behind his eyes that she would remember later. Not anger. Recognition. The specific, tired recognition of a man who has been told this exact sentence, in one form or another, by one system or another, at the worst possible moment of his life, before. Around them, the waiting room went on being a waiting room. A teenager with a wrapped wrist scrolled his phone, bored past the point of caring who was. Next, an older woman in the far corner chair pressed a rosary between her fingers without looking up, the beads clicking softly, a small mechanical prayer running on its own while the rest of her watched the doors. Nobody moved to help, because nobody in that room had any way of knowing what Daniel knew. That a child's airway can go from narrow to closed in less time than it takes to fill out an intake form, and that by the time a monitor screams about it, the window for the easy fix has usually already shut. He did not argue. He shifted Milo higher against his shoulder, felt the boy's ribs working like a bellows too small for its job, and he began walking. Not toward the doors, not toward the parking lot, but down the hallway marked staff only, the one he had a badge for, because Ashgrove Regional Medical Center employed Daniel Cole 4 nights a week to push a mop bucket down that exact hallway, and not one person on the day shift had ever asked him a single question about the 8-year gap in his resume. "Sir," Renata was already coming around the desk. "Sir, you cannot go back there." "Watch me," Daniel said, and for the first time in 6 years, something in his chest that had been folded very small and put away in the dark began, without his permission, to unfold. Behind them, at the nurse's station, a monitor Daniel had quietly recalibrated 3 weeks earlier, after noticing, on his rounds, that its readings drifted half a percentage point low every 4 hours. A thing not one nurse on 3 different shifts had caught. Beeped once, correctly, exactly on schedule. Nobody looked at it. Nobody yet knew to ask why the new janitor's fingerprints were the last ones logged in that machine's maintenance history, or why they matched a signature buried in a service record 7 states away under a different job title. Entirely. 2 minutes from now, that would start to matter. Right now, all that mattered to Daniel Cole was the door at the end of the hallway, the one with the red emergency trauma sign above it, and the fact that behind it were people whose job it was to save children, and in front of it was his son, running out of time. He did not know it yet, but by the time this night was over, Renata Voss would know his full name, his old rank, and exactly what he had done for a living before he ever picked up a mop. And she would spend the rest of her career wondering how she had looked directly at a man who once kept 11 soldiers alive on a dirt road in Kandahar and seen only a stain on a jacket. 4. Now, he pushed through the door, and the hallway lights buzzed overhead. And somewhere behind him, Renata Voss was already reaching for her radio, torn between calling security and calling for backup. Not yet sure which man was walking into her trauma bay. 8 months earlier, Daniel Cole had stood in the Human Resources Office of Ashgrove Regional Medical Center and filled out an application for the overnight custodial position with a hand that did not shake, because he had trained it over 2 years of practice, not 2. The woman across the desk had glanced at the gap in his employment history. 2019 to present, blank, and asked, gently, if there was anything he wanted to explain. Daniel had said, family circumstances, and she had nodded and moved on, because that was a phrase people did not push against, and he had chosen it precisely because it was true and told her nothing at all. What he did not say was that from 2011 to 2019 he had been a combat medic, an Army 68 whiskey, and that in his last 2 years of service he had been the kind of medic other medics asked for by name, the one who could find a vein on a patient in shock in the dark. The one whose hands did not stop moving even when the ground was shaking from something 200 meters away. He did not say that he had come home to Elena and, 3 years later, to Milo, and that for one perfect stretch of time he had thought the hardest part of his life was already behind him. He did not say that Elena had started getting tired in a way that wasn't like her, and that when he'd said the word arrhythmia to the intake nurse at a different hospital, in a different city, 2 years ago, she had looked at him the exact way Renata Voss would one day look at him and said, "We have a system, sir," and had put Elena's chart 4 spots back in the queue behind 2 sprained ankles and a migraine, because Elena did not look sick enough, not yet, not on paper. By the time anyone looked, she was gone. He remembered the exact words the attending had used, walking out to the family room with his mask still hanging around his neck. We did everything we could once we understood what we were dealing with. Daniel remembered thinking, in the flat, ringing silence that followed, that the sentence was true. And also the cruelest thing anyone had ever said to him. Because once we understood meant it had taken them 3 hours to understand something he had tried to tell the intake nurse in the first 4 minutes. Daniel had held his medical bag one last time, in the driveway of the house they had bought together, and had not been able to make himself open it. He had sold his certifications forward in his mind like a debt he no longer had the right to collect on. If knowing everything he knew had not been enough to save the person he loved most, then knowing it counted for nothing, and he would rather mop floors than ever again let someone hand him a life and trust him not to lose it. So he took the job at Ashgrove, not because he wanted to be near medicine, Because in some part of himself, he could not fully explain even to himself. He wanted to be near a place where help existed. In case, someday, Milo needed it fast, and his father was already inside the building when it happened. He never guessed the day would come this soon, or that the help would fail Milo the exact same way it had failed Elena. Renata Voss had built her 14-year career on the opposite instinct, that feelings were unreliable and systems were not. She had come up through Ashgrove during a stretch when the was chronically understaffed, when tired residents made small mistakes that became large ones, and she had watched, early in her career, as a charge nurse before her let a hysterical father talk his way to the front of the line for what turned out to be a stubbed toe. While, 4 bays down, a quiet, uncomplaining elderly woman with a silent heart attack waited 40 extra minutes and did not survive them. Renata had been the one who found her. She had never told anyone how long she had stood in room 6 afterward, looking down at a woman named Carmen Alvarez, 61 years old, who had waited without complaint for 40 extra minutes because someone louder had gone first, or how many nights since she had lain awake doing the math on those minutes, wondering which of the 2 numbers. The wait time or the noise level. The hospital's own review board would have blamed if anyone had ever bothered to ask her instead of the chart. 6 weeks before this night, that same instinct had almost shown Renata something true, and she had walked past it. A resident had asked the overnight janitor to hold a portable X-ray plate steady for 30 seconds while short-staffed, an ordinary favor, the kind nobody thinks twice about. Daniel had positioned the boy's arm himself first, without being asked, angling it 2 degrees off what the resident had set up, murmuring something about a cleaner read on the growth plate. The film had come back better than expected. The resident had laughed it off as a lucky guess from a guy who'd clearly watched a lot of medical television. And Renata, passing the doorway with an armful of charts, had heard it, filed it under one more strange, harmless thing about the quiet man with the mop, and kept walking. She had not asked herself, not once, why a lucky guess would know the word growth plate at all. After that, she had made herself into a wall. Triage by the book, no exceptions, because exceptions were how quiet patients died while loud ones were rewarded for being loud. Her colleagues respected her and, some of them, quietly resented her, and she had made peace with. Both because the alternative, trusting her gut over her protocol, had already cost someone their life once, and it had not been her gut that had been punished for it. It had been a woman in room 6 who never got to leave. So when a man in a janitor's jacket knelt at her desk and said the word retractions, some old, buried, protective part of her heard, another loud parent, and moved to shut the door on it before it could cost someone quieter their turn. It was not cruelty. It was armor. But armor does not know the difference between the enemy and the person who is right. 3 weeks before this night, that armor had already cracked once, just slightly, without her noticing. She had come on shift to find the pulse ox monitor. At bay 6, reading clean and precise for the first time in a month, after logging a maintenance ticket that it had ignored twice. When she'd asked the day charge nurse who'd finally fixed it, the answer had been a shrug. Some overnight janitor flagged it and called facilities himself. Guy said the calibration was drifting. Renata had thought, distantly, that it was an oddly specific thing for a janitor to notice, filed it under strange but harmless, and gone back to her 60 other problems. She had not connected it, not once, to the quiet man who emptied her break room trash can every night at 11 and never said more than evening on his way past. Now that same man was 90 seconds ahead of her down a hallway he had no clinical authority to be in, carrying a child whose oxygen was dropping by the second, and every rule Renata Voss had built her career on told her to stop him. Every rule except the one small, stubborn fact she could not quite silence. He had used a word tonight that panicked parents never used, and somewhere behind her ribs, underneath 14 years of armor, something old and unprotocoled was beginning, very quietly, to wonder if she had just made the second worst mistake of her career. 40 minutes earlier, before any of this had a name yet, Renata had watched Daniel wipe down the vending machine glass near the waiting room and said, without any real edge to it, the kind of comment she made a dozen times a shift and never thought twice about. Careful not to restock that thing yourself. Merker. Cole. Wouldn't want you moonlighting as my dietitian, too. She had meant it as nothing. He had smiled the polite, closed smile of a man who had learned exactly how much of himself to show people, and said nothing back. And neither of them had known that the granola bar sitting in slot C4, its allergen warning printed one font size too small and half obscured by a faded price sticker, was already sitting in Milo's coat pocket, unwrapped, half-eaten, 20 minutes from becoming the reason this night existed at all. The trauma bay doors swung open onto controlled chaos, and for 1/2 second, every head in the room turned toward the man who was not supposed to be there. Dr. Adiez Okafor, second-year resident, looked up from the stroke patient she had just finished intubating, blood pressure, cuff still in her hand, and saw a janitor. She recognized the jacket, had seen him refilling paper towels 100 times, holding a cyanotic child, and her first instinct was the same as Renata's had been. Get security. Her second instinct arrived half a beat later, when Daniel said, in a voice with no wasted words in it, 6-year-old male, sudden onset stridor and progressive cyanosis. No. Known trauma. Possible anaphylactic airway swelling. He had a granola bar from the vending machine 40 minutes ago, and the wrapper doesn't list the allergen warning that it should. I need epinephrine, weight-based, 0.15 milligrams, and I need it before he loses his airway completely, not after. The room did not move for exactly 1 second. Then it moved very fast. Dr. Okafor did not stop to ask how a janitor knew a pediatric epinephrine dose to 2 decimal places, because Milo's lips were the color of a bruise, and there was no time to ask anything at all. She was already reaching for the crash cart, already calling the number back to a nurse to confirm it, and the confirmed number matched Daniel's exactly. Renata arrived in the doorway 6 seconds behind him, radio still in. Her hand. Security's voice crackling through it, unanswered, and stopped cold at what she saw. The janitor from the overnight shift kneeling beside her resident, 2 fingers pressed with total precision against the boy's throat, tilting his chin at an angle that opened the airway a fraction wider. Murmuring something low and steady into the child's ear that was not panic, was the opposite of panic. Hey, bud, I've got you. Breathe with me. Small breath. There you go. Small breath. While around him, trained medical professionals moved at his direction like it was the most natural thing in the world. It should not have been natural. It was. And that was the part that frightened her. Someone explain to me right now what is happening in my trauma bay, Renata said. And her voice, 4. The first time that night did not sound like a wall. It sounded like a woman standing on ground that had just shifted under her. Nobody answered, because everybody was busy, and in the gap where an answer should have been, Renata's eyes went instead to the thing that had fallen, unnoticed, from the torn inner pocket of Daniel's work jacket when he'd knelt. A laminated card, corners gone. Soft and gray with years of handling, tucked for so long behind a folded photograph that the photograph had come out with it. A crayon drawing, small, careful, 3 figures holding hands under a yellow crayon sun, the tallest figure's name written in a child's shaky letters, Daddy. Beside it, half covering it, the laminated card had a faded army seal, a photograph of a younger, harder-eyed version of the man now kneeling on her floor, and 2 words beneath his rank that made Renata's stomach drop straight through the tile. Combat medic. She had walked past this man 4 nights a week for 8 months. She had told him, 40 seconds ago, that he needed to sit down and wait his turn. She thought of the pulse ox monitor, quietly and correctly recalibrated 3 weeks ago by hands. Nobody had thought to ask any questions about. She thought of the word retractions, the one word a frightened parent should not have known to use, and she felt something cold move through her that was not quite guilt yet, because guilt required her to fully understand what she had almost cost him, and she was not there yet. She was still catching up. The epinephrine went in. 30 seconds crawled by like an hour. Then Milo's chest, which had been fighting for every half-breath, pulled in one long, ragged, whole one, and the monitor's tone. That same monitor, the one Daniel had fixed without being asked, climbed steadily out of the low 80s and kept climbing, and the whole room exhaled at once, the way rooms do when they realize, together, that the worst thing did not happen. Daniel did not celebrate. He did not look around the room for acknowledgement. He kept his hand on his son's chest, feeling it rise and fall under his palm, counting the breaths silently the way he had counted 100 other patients' breaths a lifetime ago, in a life he had told himself was over. It was Dr. Okafor who finally asked it, quietly, not accusing, just needing to know, "Who are you?" Daniel did not look up from Milo. "Nobody you needed to know about," he said. Until tonight, behind him, in the doorway, Renata Voss stood very still, the crayon drawing of 3 people holding hands still trembling faintly in her hand, and understood, with the specific, sick clarity of someone watching a mistake finish arriving, that the story she would have to explain to her supervisor tomorrow was not going to be the one she thought she was writing 3 minutes ago. It had not looked like much, at first. Milo had tugged at his own collar in the waiting room chair, complaining in the particular whiny register of a tired 6-year-old that his throat felt itchy weird, and Daniel, exhausted from a double shift, had almost told him to stop. Fussing before some old, half-forgotten instinct made him crouch down instead and actually look, really look, at his son's face. The first hive had bloomed along Milo's jaw like a small red thumbprint. By the time Daniel had counted 3 more, the boy's voice had already thinned out at the edges, and by the time he'd reached the triage desk 30 seconds later, that thinning voice had become the whistling half-breaths that would, in another few minutes, turn his lips the color of a bruise. It was the kind of speed that only ever made sense to someone who had watched a body fail before and knew that the gap between fine and not fine was never as wide as it looked from the outside. By the time Dr. Samuel Ortiz, Ashgrove's chief of trauma surgery, arrived on the floor 20 minutes later. Paged in not for Milo, who was stable now, small chest rising and falling in an easy, ordinary rhythm under a blanket printed with cartoon dinosaurs, but for the gunshot wound in Bay 2. The hallway outside the trauma bay had filled the way hallways do after something has happened. Nurses who had somewhere else to be finding reasons to walk past slowly. A security guard who had arrived 7 minutes too late for whatever crisis he'd been called about, standing awkwardly with nothing left to secure. Ortiz stopped mid-stride when he saw the man sitting on an upturned supply crate outside Base 6, jacket still crumpled where a child had gripped it, holding that same laminated card between 2 fingers like he wasn't sure yet whether to put it away or burn it. "Cole?" Ortiz said, and the word came out strange, disbelieving, like a name pulled up from very far underwater. Daniel Cole. Kandahar. The convoy pull, the vehicle that flipped on root whiskey. You're the corpseman who kept that gunner alive for 40 minutes with a chest seal made out of a ration wrapper. The hallway, which had been full of quiet motion, went. Still enough that the ventilation system's hum became, for a moment, the loudest thing in it. A clipboard slid from a nurse's hand at the station and hit the floor with a flat slap that nobody moved to pick up. Dr. Okafor, still in the doorway of Base 6, went very pale and very quiet, running back through the last 20 minutes in her head. Every calm, precise instruction she had taken from a man in a janitor's jacket without once questioning why he gave them like orders instead of guesses. "I was there too," Ortiz said. "Different unit. I remember your name because everyone did, after that. And then you just disappeared. Nobody could ever tell me where you went. I went home," Daniel said. "And then I stopped being that person, because being that person didn't save the one life I actually needed it to save." His voice did not rise. It did not need to. Tonight it saved the other one. That's the whole story. There isn't a bigger one underneath it. Renata Voss had come to stand a few feet away, close enough to hear, and she did not try to disappear into the hallway the way some part of her wanted to. She made herself stay. "Mr. Cole," she said. When Ortiz had gone, when it was only the 2 of them and a boy asleep 2 feet away under a dinosaur blanket. "I told you to sit down and wait your turn. You did. I had reasons for that. Real ones. A room full of people who all think they're the most urgent thing in the building. And a system that only works if I don't let the loudest voice win by default." She looked at the crayon drawing still in her hand, the 3 careful figures under the sun, and made herself say the rest of it. "But I didn't listen to you. I looked at a jacket and decided I already knew what kind of parent I was dealing with, and I was wrong in a way that could have cost you your son. And I don't have a protocol that fixes that. I just have. I'm sorry." That's all I've got tonight. Daniel studied her for a long moment. He thought of another hospital, another charge nurse, another version of this exact sentence spoken 2 years too late over a different bed, and felt the old grief move through him. Not gone. It would never be entirely gone, but no longer the only thing in the room. "You called someone," he said finally. "That's not nothing. You didn't ignore him. You just didn't know yet what you were looking at." He glanced at Milo, breathing easy now, one small fist curled loose against the pillow. "I'm not interested in a lawsuit or a headline or whatever the hospital's going to. Want to do to make this go away quietly. I want one thing. Name it. When my shift ends at 6, I want to walk out that door and clock back in tomorrow night like nothing happened. I like the mop. I like that nobody in this building has needed anything from me for 8 months except clean floors. I'd like to keep it that way, if it's all. The same to you." Renata almost smiled, and did not quite manage it, because there was still too much in her chest to make room for it yet. "I don't think that's going to be entirely possible," she said. "But I'll fight for as much of it as I can." 3 weeks later, Ashgrove's Ethics and Quality Board completed a review that would quietly change 2 things: a formal escalation pathway for any staff member, clinical license or not, who correctly identified a deteriorating patient, and a mandatory retraining rotation for triage leadership, the kind that does not make headlines but changes, slowly, how a hospital listens. Renata Voss did not lose her position, but she was pulled off overnight triage for 8 weeks and required to sit through the same retraining she had once taught. New hires herself, on the other side of the desk this time, and she did not appeal it, because for once the consequence felt smaller than the thing it was answering for. She asked, when the 8 weeks ended, to be the one who taught the new module going forward, because she had learned the hardest way there was that a system built only to prevent the last mistake will always be blind to the next one, wearing a different jacket. Daniel did not take the reward money the hospital's foundation quietly offered him, and did not agree to the interview a local reporter kept calling about. He did agree, 3 weeks after that, to sit for one afternoon with a stack of dusty paperwork and let a friend of Ortiz's help him start the slow process of renewing a medical license he had let expire on purpose 6 years ago, in a driveway he still sometimes dreamed about. On a Sunday evening, not long after, Daniel sat on the low concrete steps behind their apartment building, the closest thing they had to a porch, and watched Milo carefully tape a new drawing to the refrigerator through the screen door. 3 figures again, holding hands under. A yellow sun, except this time there was a 4th small figure standing a little apart from the rest, in a nurse's uniform, and Milo had written her name underneath in careful, shaky letters. Miss Renata, she helped too. Daniel did not say anything for a while. He just watched his son's hand smooth the tape flat, unhurried, certain, the way children are certain about things adults have long since made complicated. "Do you think she'll come visit again?" Milo asked through the screen, not turning around. "I think she might," Daniel said. Renata had, in fact, stopped by twice already, once with a bag of groceries she pretended were just extra from her own shopping, and once with nothing at all, just to sit on the steps for 20 minutes and not talk about the hospital. Neither of them had needed to say out loud what those visits were actually about. "Good," Milo said, satisfied, and went back to smoothing the tape. Daniel looked down at his hands, steadier now than they had been in years, though he had not noticed the change happening, and thought about how strange it was that the thing he had spent 6 years trying to bury had turned out to be the exact thing that saved the only person he had left to save. There is a particular kind of quiet that only exists after a storm has passed and been survived, and it is different from the quiet that came before the storm. Heavier in some ways, lighter in others, carrying the specific weight of everything that almost happened and did not. The people we dismiss too quickly are so rarely the empty vessels our first glance decides they are. More often they are simply carrying something we have not yet earned the right to see, folded small and put away out of grief or fear or the plain exhausted hope that they will never be asked to carry it again. And the only real tragedy is not that the world so often looks at such people and sees nothing worth a second glance. It is that some of them wait their whole lives for someone to look twice and never get the chance to be seen at all. Daniel Cole got his chance on an ordinary Tuesday night in a hallway that smelled like antiseptic and old coffee, because for once, someone finally slowed down long enough to hear the word. Underneath the panic, He hoped, watching his son's careful tape job through the screen door, that it would not take a crisis to make people slow down the next time. But if it ever did again, he knew now that he would not hesitate. Some promises, it turned out, were not meant to be kept forever. Only until the day they cost you more than breaking them would.